All right, so let's talk now about the angiosperm life cycle. So angiosperms, those technically means covered seeds. We could also think of these as our flowering plant. So any plant that produces a flower is going to be an angiosperm. Just like we saw in the gymnosperms, we have no more swimming sperm. So it's an adaptation to live away from water. And instead, and also like we saw in the gymnosperms, there is no free-living gametophyte stage. Now the gametophyte is produced by the sporophyte and is dependent upon the sporophyte. What we're looking at here is a very basic structure of a flower. This piece right here, this is the male reproductive structure. We call this the stamen. Male reproductive structure. It produces pollen. This piece right here is technically where the pollen comes from. That's the anther. And then this stalk that the anther sits on, we call that the filament. Okay, so this is where the pollen comes from. So the pollen are those haploid gametophyte stage that represent the male gamete. This middle structure, this is what we call the pistil or the carpel. Both terms are technically correct. This represents the female reproductive structure. So we have multiple pieces here. We have this top area right here. We call this the stigma. This section right here, we call that the style. And this region right here, we call that the ovary. Okay, so I just redrew some of these pieces just for simplicity's sake. So again, the carpel or the pistil, that's the female reproductive structures right there in the middle. The stamen, which contains the anther, and the filament, that produces the pollen. Okay, so how does reproduction happen? So angiosperms get their gametes together in many different ways, but they're known for having flowers. They're known for having petals, especially on their flowers, which are devices to attract pollinators, things like bees, butterflies, birds, things like that. Okay. So they a lot of times will employ third parties to help them get their gametes together. So bee is going to come by, let's say. It's going to get some of this pollen. It's going to get some of that pollen on its legs or its belly or whatever. It's then going to take it to another flower, ideally, and it's going to basically deliver that pollen to that second flower. Especially, we're looking to have it deliver that pollen right here to that stigma. This pollen grain is haploid, and it represents the male gametophyte stage. Okay, so this haploid pollen grain, once it's attached to the stigma, and the stigma says, okay, you're not my own pollen, you're pollen from another plant, that pollen grain grows a pollen tube structure that's going to move down through the style, down into the ovary, into the micropyle, in order to deliver that haploid pollen grain into the egg. Once that egg is fertilized, that egg that's contained inside of that ovary, pollen nuclei, that haploid pollen cell will move down through the pollen tube, deliver its nuclei into the egg, and now this cell is diploid. So the egg cell was also haploid. Pollen nuclei is haploid as well. So those represent the gametophyte stage. They recombine. We now get that diploid sporophyte embryo. And that is going to be surrounded. This brand new embryo is going to divide. It's going to become the next sporophyte generation. It is the seed. It is the embryo that's inside of the seed. So now this embryo is going to be encased in the actual flesh of the seed. So our embryo itself is diploid. This nutritive tissue out here, the rest of the seed, what we think about when we're like eating like a peanut or something, or the actual flesh of that seed that we're eating for food, it's actually triploid. So it has 3 copies of each chromosome, because angiosperms do something called double fertilization, which we'll talk about later. Okay, but this tissue out here, this triploid, what we call endosperm tissue, endosperm, That provides energy to this embryo. So that way, as it grows, as it's germinating, until it can grow its first set of leaves, it has energy. And then once it has leaves, it can photosynthesize and has all of the energy that it'll need. The embryo then will grow into the next generation of plants, and the whole thing starts over again.